What if the most famous list of ancient wonders is also a list of what the world failed to keep? Most of us carry a version of the seven wonders: a pyramid, a garden, a statue of a god, a temple, a tomb, a bronze giant, a lighthouse. The list feels finished. It belongs to school. It belongs to the past. But the list itself is old, much older than the classroom posters and the tourist guides. It comes from Greek travellers who moved through a world that was already full of ruins and already full of memory. One of the earliest voices is a poet named Antipater of Sidon. Another is an engineer and writer, Philo of Byzantium. They did not invent the monuments, but they helped shape the list that reached us. And here is the strange part. Almost everything on that list vanished. The gardens are gone. No one is certain where they stood. The statue of Zeus disappeared into a fire. The temple at Ephesus is now a single column in a marsh. The great tomb at Halicarnassus was pulled apart and turned into a castle. The bronze giant of Rhodes collapsed in an earthquake and was sold for scrap. The Lighthouse of Alexandria fell into the sea, and its stones were reused in a fortress. Only the Great Pyramid still stands, the oldest of the seven, and even it keeps spaces that modern instruments are only now beginning to see. So the list feels permanent, but the monuments were not permanent at all. That is the first pressure against the simple version of the story. The list is not a solid record of what the ancient world built. It is a memory of things that the world could not hold on to. It is a traveller's selection, copied and recopied, shaped by one culture's idea of wonder, and then handed down as if it were the whole picture. This does not mean the list is wrong. It means the list is the first wonder, a fragile catalogue of loss that survived after stone, bronze, gardens, and fire disappeared. The real journey is not to admire the monuments one by one. It is to follow what remains: a name, a fragment, a submerged block, a word that still travels. In the next hour and a half, we will move through 100 facts, not as a checklist, not as a trivia tour, but as a calm, slow walk through 7 different ways of vanishing. Through the pyramid that refused to fall, the garden that may have been built in the wrong city, the god made of wood and ivory that needed oil just to survive the day, the temple that doubled as a bank, the tomb that gave its name to every monumental grave after it, the bronze giant that became more powerful on the ground than it ever was standing, and the lighthouse that dissolved into the language of light. If this mystery pulls you in, like subscribe, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. So the first question is not about one monument, it is about the list itself. Why did these 7 survive in memory when so many other candidates were left out? Who decided what belonged on the list and what got forgotten? And what does it mean to carry a memory of things that are almost entirely gone? Who decided that 7 objects should define the ancient world's greatest achievements? The answer begins not with kings or priests, but with travellers. People who moved through a world far larger than the Mediterranean, saw things that astonished them, and then tried to capture that astonishment in words. Think of the list not as a museum catalogue carved by some official committee. Think of it as a traveller's memory book, a collection of what was most famous, most talked about, most worth the long journey. It was shaped by what was accessible to Greek eyes, what was spectacular enough to survive the retelling, and what felt, in that moment, like the peak of human effort. The list is not the whole ancient world. It is the doorway through which later centuries learned to imagine that world. The oldest known voice in this tradition belonged to a poet named Antipater of Sidon. Writing in the 2nd century before Christ, he composed an epigram that praised the 7 sights, the Theomata, as works that dimmed the sun itself. He travelled to see them, or at least claimed he had, and his words gave the list its first literary shape. A few generations later, a writer known as Philo of Byzantium compiled a short book called The 7 Sights of the World. It was part guide, part admiration, and it helped fix the number 7 and the core candidates in the imagination of the Greek-speaking world. These early guidebooks were not comprehensive surveys. They reflected a specific moment and a specific culture. The Greeks were fascinated by scale, by technical audacity, by the way a building could seem to break the rules of nature. They looked at Egypt, at Babylon, at the lands around the eastern Mediterranean, and they selected. They ignored vast achievements elsewhere: the step pyramids of the Americas, the ornate cities of the Indus Valley, the enormous earthworks of northern Europe. None of these entered the list because the list makers did not know them or did not consider them part of their world. The canon was shaped by geography as much as by taste. This means the list we inherit is not a fixed star but a human-made constellation. The seven wonders gained their power precisely because they were chosen, copied, and repeated. The ancient world was much larger than the list, but the list became the world people remembered. The rejected wonders, the walls of Babylon, the brick tower, the labyrinth of Egypt, even the Roman Colosseum when later writers tried to add it, gradually faded from common memory. The survivors of the list became stronger simply because the list itself survived. So the question shifts. If the list is a selection, what did it leave out? And why did the number 7, of all numbers, become the sacred frame for this ancient memory? Why 7? The number feels mystical, but it also feels practical. Because the list we carry in our minds is not the whole ancient world. It is a selection, and every selection leaves something out. Imagine a memory game. You're a traveller returning from the eastern edges of the Greek-speaking world. You have seen temples, statues, gardens, walls, mountains, rivers and ruins. But you can only carry 7 images home. Not 8, not 12. 7. It is small enough to recall, yet large enough to feel complete. For ancient minds, 7 was already a sacred container. 7 planets moved in the sky. 7 notes made a musical scale. 7 days shaped the week. So when a list of wonders began to harden into a canon, the number 7 was waiting to receive it. The walls of Babylon were almost certainly more impressive than some of the wonders that made the final cut. Greek travellers described them with awe. A double line of baked brick, wide enough for chariots to race along the top, stretching for miles around the great city. And yet they did not enter the list. The brick tower, the ziggurat of Babylon, a mountain of baked clay reaching toward the sky, was also left behind. The labyrinth of Egypt, a vast complex of courts and passages that one ancient visitor claimed surpassed even the pyramids, vanished from the final selection. Alexander the Great's projects never became wonders either. His funeral carriage, a moving temple of gold and ivory, rolled through the ancient imagination and then disappeared. Later, Roman writers tried to create their own rival lists. They proposed the Capitol, the Pantheon, the Colosseum. But the old Greek list held firm. The 7 remained 7. Every attempt to add an 8th wonder felt like a ghost hand trying to open a door that had already closed. The list is not a neutral catalogue. It is a memory machine. And every machine has a shape. 7 was the shape ancient memory chose. It turned a vast, messy, multilingual world into something a traveller could carry home. The number did not simply count the wonders. It sealed them. It made the list feel finished, even sacred. But that closure carried a cost. Every wonder that did not fit was slowly erased from the shared memory. The walls of Babylon crumbled not only in the earth, but in the mind. The brick tower became a footnote. The labyrinth became a rumour. The rejected wonders became ghosts, and the surviving 7 became brighter because of the darkness around them. So the number 7 is not just a number. It is the outline of ancient loss. It tells us that the list was never a neutral survey. It was an act of preservation, but also an act of forgetting. And the things it forgot make the things it remembered feel more fragile, more precious, and more strange. Now the frame is complete. The list is not a fixed tablet of stone. It is a human handprint, pressed into time by travellers who wanted to hold the ancient world in their memory before it slipped away. But one of those 7 wonders refused to slip away at all. The oldest wonder still stands. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the one survivor of the 7 wonders, waits on the edge of the desert. It is the anchor when every other wonder is gone. It is the stone that begins the journey through time, labour, hidden chambers, and the long silence of survival. From the fragile list of wonders, we now step onto the Giza plateau, where the oldest wonder still stands. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the only one of the 7 that refused to fall. When Antipater of Sidon wrote his list more than 2,000 years ago, the pyramid was already ancient. It had watched empires rise and break. It had watched the other wonders burn, collapse and sink into the ground. And still, it stood. Most of us know the pyramid from photographs, a simple triangle against the desert sky, a postcard of ancient Egypt. But up close, it becomes something stranger. The pyramid is not a perfect flat-sided triangle. Each face is slightly concave, bent inward by a fraction of a degree along the centre line. From the ground, the human eye cannot see it. But from the air, at the right moment of the morning sun, the light catches the hollow and splits each face into two halves of shadow. The ancient builders did not carve that curve by accident. The concave face works like a giant stone sundial. As the sun moves, the shadow sharpens on one side and softens on the other. The whole pyramid becomes a clock, marking the equinoxes with a precision that still works today. The stone itself is a calendar, and inside the temperature never changes. Deep in the king's chamber, the air stays at a steady 20 degrees Celsius, no matter how hot the desert burns outside. The granite walls hold the same cool stillness that they held 4,500 years ago. The pyramid breathes stone, yet the man who built it left almost no image of himself. Khufu, the king who raised the largest monument on earth, is known to us through a single tiny statue. It is carved from ivory, just 7 centimeters high, small enough to hold in your palm, a king who commanded enough stone to build a mountain left behind a face no bigger than a thumb. The pyramid is his signature, but it is a signature written in silence. So the oldest wonder is not simply a survivor. It is a technical object, a machine of stone and light and steady temperature. It is familiar from far away, but the closer you look, the stranger it becomes. The pyramid survived, but it did not explain itself. It keeps more inside than it gives away. And inside, the pyramid still has rooms the modern world has not fully opened. Hidden spaces have waited in the dark while centuries passed above them. In the 21st century, scientists turned a new kind of eye toward the stone. They used cosmic rays, particles born in deep space, to see through walls that no one had looked behind. What they found was a void, a space that should not be there. If this mystery pulls you in, subscribe, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. The pyramid that survived the ancient world is still not finished with us. In the next part, we will follow those cosmic rays into the dark and into the void that no one expected. We have looked at the outside of the Great Pyramid, its concave faces, its steady temperature, its missing capstone. Now we move inside, but not through any door. We move inside through particles from space. The pyramid looks solid. But in the year 2017, a team of scientists used cosmic rays to see inside it. What they found was a void, a space that had no obvious purpose, no known entrance, and no clear function. Cosmic ray muons act like natural X-rays. They're tiny particles that rain down from the upper atmosphere all the time. When they pass through stone, they leave a faint pattern. Dense stone blocks more particles, and empty space lets more through. By mapping that pattern, by watching where the muons travelled, scientists can see empty spaces without moving a single block. It is a way of looking through stone without ever touching it. Using this method, the Scan Pyramids project revealed a chamber at least 30 meters long, sitting high above the Grand Gallery. It is not a tomb. It is not a passage to some known room. It is simply a space, sealed, silent, and closed for thousands of years. Now think about how the pyramid has been opened before. More than 1,000 years ago, in the 9th century, a caliph named Al-Mamun forced a tunnel into the northern face. He was looking for ancient treasures or hidden chambers. His workers broke through solid limestone, following nothing but rumour and hope. They found only the same narrow corridors that every later visitor would know: the descending passage, the ascending passage, the grand gallery, the king's chamber. The pyramid gave them nothing new. Yet the pyramid held other rooms his chisels never reached, rooms that no torch ever lit. The old darkness was not empty. It was waiting. That is the strange thing. The pyramid has been opened by men for centuries, and still it keeps chambers beyond them. Modern detection makes this ancient monument feel alive again. The oldest wonder on the list, the only one that still stands, has rooms the modern world had to rediscover with cosmic particles. It is not a solved puzzle, it is a survivor that keeps something back. And that is not a failure of our knowledge, it is a quality of the monument itself. A pyramid that gave away all its secrets would not cast so long a shadow. But a hidden void is not the only thing trapped inside these stones. How much labour, how much design, is locked into a single block of the Great Pyramid? The pyramid is not only a shape, it is distance, chemistry, and the effort of human hands. The hidden chamber may keep its silence, but the pyramid is also a body built from effort that stretched across an entire kingdom. Every block, every joint, Every lifted stone is a decision that costs time, food, and lives. So the next question is not only what the pyramid holds inside, but what it took to become a shape at all. Think of the pyramid not as a finished monument, but as a chain of procedures that no one today can fully repeat. Mortar had to be mixed to a recipe that modern laboratories cannot copy with certainty. Massive granite beams had to move from a quarry 800 kilometers to the south. A ship had to be buried beside the king, and a golden point had to sit at the very top of the structure. Each step was a form of knowledge, and most of that knowledge disappeared with the people who practiced it. Start with the mortar. The blocks of the Great Pyramid are not simply stacked dry. A thin layer of a pale, cement-like material fills the joints, and after more than 4,500 years it still holds. Chemists have tried to reproduce it from the local raw materials available to the ancient builders, and the exact formula remains elusive. Something in the mixing process, perhaps an additive that left no trace, gave this substance a grip that outlasted empires. The stone survives, but the recipe is gone. Then there is the granite. The pyramid is mostly local limestone, but some of its heaviest stones weigh up to 50 tons and came from Aswan near the first cataract of the Nile. That is 800 kilometers away. The most likely route was by river, floating the monoliths on barges during the annual flood when the water rose high enough to cover the banks. But moving 50 tons onto a boat, keeping it stable, and then lifting it onto the plateau required a level of coordination that leaves no simple diagram. The river was the highway, but the loading and unloading were acts of collective timing that vanished with the workers who remembered the signals and the rhythms. On the south side of the pyramid, a long pit was discovered in the 20th century. Inside lay a vessel made of cedar wood, carefully dismantled into over 1,000 pieces. This was the solar boat, a ship buried to carry the king across the sky with the sun god. The wood came from Lebanon, another long journey, and the boat was stitched together with rope, not nailed. It speaks of a journey after death, but it also speaks of a living world of trade, carpentry, and ritual that left no written manual. And then the top. The pyramid today is flat, but it was not always so. Ancient sources describe a pyramidion, a capstone that may have been covered in gold or electrum catching the first and last light of the sun. That capstone is missing. No one knows when it fell, or if it was taken down deliberately, or if it was never placed at all. The pyramid, for all its survival, reaches a blank instead of a point. The golden crown that once pulled the whole shape upward is absent. The pyramid is not a simple pile of stones. It is a system of materials, transport, and symbolic completion that no longer exists. The mortar, the river, the ship, the gold, all of them were part of the finished object, and almost all of them have dissolved into the landscape or into silence. What remains is the stone skeleton, immense and stubborn, but stripped of the living procedures that raised it. So the oldest wonder on the list outlasted its own builders and their recipes. Yet the plateau around it does not feel solved. The Sphinx, with its damaged face and its body carved from a single outcrop, keeps drawing attention to a deeper question. Some researchers argue that its erosion patterns suggest water, not only wind, and that the climate of the plateau may have been wetter when it was first shaped. The pyramid itself holds mathematical ratios that feel too precise to be accidental. Why do these details keep pointing beyond ordinary tomb imagery? The story of Giza is not finished, and the next traces move from the pyramid to the guardian that sits beside it. The Great Pyramid is not alone on the Giza plateau. A short walk away, facing the sunrise, sits the Sphinx, and its presence keeps reopening questions that the pyramid alone cannot answer. Think of the Sphinx not as a solved statue, but as a stone that has been rained on. When water falls on limestone over long periods, it does not chip the surface like wind-blown sand. It carves deep, rounded channels, a pattern that looks more like a weathered riverbank than a sand-scoured monument. Some researchers looked at those patterns and asked a question that still unsettles the timeline. If the Sphinx sat in heavy rain, then it must be older than the desert that surrounds it now. The missing nose is the famous detail. It has become a legend, but the nose is not the real story. The real story is written across the body of the lion. Geologist Robert Schoch proposed that the Sphinx enclosure shows water erosion consistent with a much wetter climate, a climate that last existed thousands of years before the reign of the pharaohs usually credited with carving it. This is not a settled argument. It is a trace that refuses to stay simple. The standard chronology places the Sphinx around the same era as the pyramids, but the rock seems to hold a memory of older reigns. And then there are the numbers. The Great Pyramid's dimensions contain ratios that feel too precise to ignore. The relationship between its height and its base perimeter appears to encode the number pi. The proportions of its chambers and passages have been said to reflect the golden ratio. Whether these were deliberate design choices or emergent properties of the construction method is debated, but the numbers sit there quietly, waiting for an explanation that does not force them to be either accident or advanced code. These are not proofs of a lost civilization. A weathered statue and a few embedded ratios cannot carry a claim that large, but they are not nothing either. They are the kind of detail that keeps the standard story under a gentle pressure. The accepted account is not foolish. It is well supported by centuries of study. Yet a landscape like Giza does not give up all its secrets to one interpretation. The plateau becomes something more than a collection of tombs. It becomes a place where the simple version of history feels slightly too small. The Sphinx and the pyramids together make you feel that the oldest surviving wonder is not fully silent. It keeps more questions than it answers. It offers traces, not conclusions, and perhaps that is part of its power. The survivor did not merely outlast the other 6 wonders. It outlasted the need to be fully understood. From the stone survivor, we turn to a wonder that vanished so completely that even its city is uncertain. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon begin with a mountain built inside a flat empire, a green impossibility that may have been misplaced by the very memory that preserved it. From the stone survivor of Giza, we turn to a wonder that leaves almost no physical trace, only stories of a mountain in the sky. The Hanging Gardens are the most disputed wonder on the list, but before the debate, before the archaeologists and the missing ruins, there was a story. A king built a mountain for a queen who missed the green hills of home. Imagine living in a city of mud brick and flat horizons, the sun baking the plain, the river sliding brown and slow, and then looking up to see a forest growing in mid-air, terraces of dark leaves, cool shadows, the smell of wet earth, and flowers. The gardens were not just a garden. They were a memory of mountains transplanted into the heart of a desert empire. The name most often attached to that memory is Semiramis, a warrior queen of legend said to have ruled Assyria with a fierce and brilliant hand. Later Greek writers gave her the gardens, along with walls and canals and whole cities. But the stronger thread leads to a king who definitely lived, Nebuchadnezzar II, the ruler of Babylon at its imperial height, and beside him a queen named Amytis. She came from Media, a land of forested ridges and cool green valleys. Babylon, for all its power, was flat and dusty, a city of baked brick and wide, hard light. The story says she grew sick with longing for her homeland. Not a sickness of the body, but a deeper weariness of the eye and the heart. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king who had conquered cities and moved whole peoples, decided to conquer distance and memory itself. He would build her a mountain. Trees were brought from the lands he'd subdued, cedars from Lebanon, cypress from the north, flowering plants from the eastern hills. They were planted not in the ground but on rising terraces, so that from below the whole thing looked like a steep green slope suspended above the city. Every layer was a trophy of a conquered landscape, a political statement written in leaves and shade. Power made fragrant. The gardens begin as longing. Before they were an engineering puzzle, they were a human gesture. A mountain built out of love and power, an answer to a queen's quiet sadness that no ordinary building could reach. The lost wonder gains emotional motive before engineering. This was not a decorative afterthought behind a palace wall. It was a vertical memory of a world the queen could no longer see, a piece of media lifted into the sky of Mesopotamia. And so the question becomes sharper. How do you keep a mountain alive in a brick city? How do you hold water, soil, heavy trees and the weight of an entire idea high above the ground, in a place where rain is rare and the summer heat can crack stone? The answer is not only love or ambition, it is a water machine disguised as paradise. To keep a mountain alive in a brick city you need water, and lots of it. The Hanging Gardens were not simply a garden resting on a palace roof. They were a water machine, a vertical engine of life built where life had no natural business climbing so high. Think of the gardens as a layered system, each level solving a different problem of survival. At the bottom, the Euphrates River provided the raw material. But water is heavy, and gravity pulls it downward. To lift it to the highest terrace, you need a mechanical heart. Ancient engineers devised a chain pump or water screw, a device that may have predated Archimedes by centuries. Day and night it turned, hauling water upward, feeding every step of the Green Mountain. But water can also destroy. Clay bricks dissolve, roots rot, and soil turns to mud that slides away. The builders protected the structure with a skin of bitumen, a natural tar that sealed the terraces against moisture. Over that they laid lead plates, a barrier that kept the water from reaching the brick core. And beneath it all they imported basalt slabs, a dense dark stone not found in the Babylonian plain. Basalt resists water and carries immense weight without cracking. These three materials, working together, turned a fragile pile of earth into a waterproofed monument. Above the seals, soil was piled deep enough for trees to anchor their roots. The plants themselves became part of the machine. Their leaves released moisture into the air, cooling the terraces and creating a microclimate, a pocket of damp, fragrant air that must have felt like a different world compared to the dry heat outside. Perfume plants added another layer, scent drifting down through the layers, a veil of sweetness that announced the garden before it was seen. This was not a garden on a roof. It was a water machine disguised as paradise, a system that demanded constant labour, constant fuel, constant attention. Every day, workers had to feed the lifting device, check the seals, and tend the plants. The garden was alive, but its life depended on human hands. Engineering replaces fantasy with a stranger physical image. The hanging gardens become not only a queen's comfort or a king's boast, but a technical achievement that pushed the limits of what a city could hold. Waterproofing, lifting, cooling, scent. Each layer a solution, each solution a risk. And yet, when we look for this machine in the ground of Babylon, the traces grow thin. The sources that describe such a system often point away from Babylon, toward a different city with a different king. The garden may have survived in memory while its address was copied wrong. That is the next question. If the garden moved on paper, what does that mean for the wonder itself? For centuries the hanging gardens were tied to Babylon. The name was almost a reflex. Babylon meant the gardens and the gardens meant Babylon. But the closer you look at the ground, the stranger that reflex becomes. The soil of Babylon did not easily give up a garden. The water table was high, the clay was soft, and the kind of stone that could hold a mountain of terraces was not native to the plain. So what if the most famous garden was not built in the city that wears its name? What if the address was copied wrong, and the real garden grew somewhere else, under a different king, in a different city, while the world kept repeating the wrong label? Think of the garden's address as a label that was copied and recopied over centuries. Ancient writers relied on older texts, travellers' reports, and half-remembered names. A single mistake in one manuscript, a single scribe who assumed Babylon because the story sounded Babylonian, could shift the wonder from one place to another. Over time, the original location would fade, and the new address would harden into fact. The garden would survive in memory, but it would be remembered in the wrong place. The search for the gardens began in earnest at Babylon itself. In the early 20th century, a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey excavated the site of the ancient city. He found something that seemed promising, a series of vaulted cellars near the palace, built with thick walls and waterproof bitumen. Koldewey believed he had found the foundations of the hanging gardens. The cellars, he thought, were the substructure that supported the terraces. For a while, the mystery seemed solved, but later research showed that the cellars were probably storerooms, not garden supports. They were too far from the river to easily supply the water a garden would need, and they lacked the channels and drains that a terraced garden would require. The bitumen was for keeping goods dry, not for holding a mountain of soil. The famous garden was not there. If the gardens were not at Babylon, where could they have been? The answer began to take shape not in the soil, but in cuneiform tablets. A British scholar named Stephanie Daly spent years studying the inscriptions of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled in the 7th century before Christ. Sennacherib's palace was at Nineveh, far to the north of Babylon, in a region with hills and stone and more reliable water. And his own words, carved into clay, described something remarkable. He wrote of a great garden he had built beside his palace, planted with trees brought from distant lands. He described a water-raising device, a kind of screw or chain pump, that lifted water from the river to the highest terraces. He mentioned channels and basins, and he boasted of the garden's cool shade and the scent of its plants. The engineering matched the descriptions that later Greek writers would attach to the hanging gardens. Nineveh had the water, the stone, and the written record. Babylon had the name, but not the physical evidence. This is not a debunk. It is a shift in memory. The garden may have been real, built with skill and ambition, and later travellers may have seen it or heard of it. But as centuries passed and empires fell, the story migrated. Babylon became the more famous city, the city of Nebuchadnezzar and the Jewish exile, and so the garden was remembered there. The wonder survived in descriptions, in the image of green terraces rising above a flat land, but its true address was slowly replaced by a more famous one. The garden becomes a moving target. It escapes the place attached to its name, surviving only in words and water traces. The physical ruin may lie under the mounds of Nineveh, still waiting to be fully uncovered, or it may have dissolved back into the earth so completely that only the cuneiform memory remains. Either way, the wonder is no longer a fixed point on a map. It is a story that travelled, a memory that lost its original home. Some wonders vanish because their materials fail. The Hanging Gardens may have vanished because their address was copied wrong. The garden's identity is as much about memory as about stone, and that makes its disappearance even stranger. It forces us to ask how many other ancient marvels are remembered in the wrong place, their true locations buried under centuries of misreading. From a wonder that may have moved, we turn to one that depended on constant human care. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was not stone or bronze. It was a god built from wood, gold, ivory and oil, a fragile machine of materials that had to be polished, protected and kept alive by human hands. While the gardens may have dissolved back into clay and copied words, another wonder demanded a different kind of survival. It depended on human hands, every single day. At Olympia, in a low building not far from the Great Temple, the sculptor Phidias assembled a god. The workshop was real. Archaeologists found it in the 1950s, and it still held the traces of its purpose: clay moulds for golden robes, scraps of elephant ivory, pieces of glass-paste lilies that once decorated a throne, and the simple tools of 5th century BC craftsmanship. This was not a place of prayer. It was a place of construction, where a figure over 12 meters tall took shape from materials that had no business lasting forever. The statue of Zeus was not carved from a single block of marble. It was a chryselephantine statue, a term that simply means gold and ivory on a wooden core. Think of it as a giant sacred doll. A skeleton of timber, carefully jointed to resist cracking, gave the body its posture. Over that skeleton, craftsmen fitted thin plates of ivory, polished until they glowed like skin. The god's robe, his sandals, the olive wreath on his head, and the winged victory he held in one hand were all covered in gold leaf or solid gold. His eyes were probably inlaid with precious stones. The throne alone was a riot of glass-paste lilies, painted figures, and carved myths. The scale was almost absurd. The seated Zeus rose over 12 meters from the floor, so high that his head nearly touched the cedar-beamed ceiling of the temple. Ancient visitors joked that if the god ever stood up, he would take the roof with him. That was the intended effect. A figure too large for the space that contained him, a presence that felt barely contained by the building around it. But the materials told a quieter story. Wood breathes, ivory warps if the air is too dry or too damp, gold leaf can be scratched by a careless touch. Glass paste fades. The god looked eternal, but his body was a fragile machine of organic and precious matter. Every joint, every ivory plate, every sheet of gold was a point of potential failure. The wonder was not a passive monument. It was a carefully constructed illusion of permanence, a technical achievement that asked the same question every morning. How do you keep a perishable god from falling apart? The statue of Zeus was not a distant shape on a hill. It was a living workshop product, born from human skill and vulnerable to time. What kept it from decaying century after century was not luck but a system of constant care. And that system is where the next part of the story begins. So what kept this god alive? How did such a fragile body survive for over 800 years? At the feet of the seated god, a wide shallow pool of olive oil caught the first light of morning. The dark surface turned the dawn into a slow golden mirror, and the ivory skin of Zeus seemed to glow from within. The oil was not only a sacred offering, it had a practical role that kept the wonder alive. Ivory is fragile. In the dry air of a closed temple, it cracks. A thin film of oil sealed the surface against the climate like a protective skin, and the pool itself was not simply a basin. It reflected the light upward, magnifying the illumination that fell on the gold and the carved face. The god was not only lit from above, he was lit from below by a mirror made of oil. The effect made the statue feel less like a sculpture and more like a presence that carried its own light. But the oil did not apply itself. A special order of priests, the Phaedrantai, lived and worked inside the temple. Their sole duty was to care for the statue. Every day they cleaned the ivory with soft cloths. They checked the gold plating for any dullness or damage. They poured fresh oil into the pool and onto the surfaces. The Phaedrantai were not simply cleaners. They were the keepers of a fragile technical theatre. The god could not survive without them. The awe that visitors felt, the sense of an immortal presence inside that enormous seated body, depended on a chain of human hands. The priest knew which parts of the ivory needed more oil in summer. They understood how to polish the gold without scratching it. They maintained the illusion that the god was eternal by working invisibly behind the daily miracle, and the proportions of the statue were not accidental. Phidias understood that a seated giant 40 feet tall viewed from the floor would look distorted. The head would shrink, the legs would become too short. So he adjusted the ratios. The upper body was slightly elongated, the head a little larger than natural proportion would allow. From below, the figure looked perfectly balanced. The god seemed to be seated at the exact height where the human eye expected him to be. This was not a sculptor who simply made things big. It was a sculptor who understood how the human eye would receive the image and corrected for the angle of worship. The maintenance itself was part of the experience. The Phaedrantai performed their duties in sight of certain visitors, especially on festival days. The ritual of oil and cloth became a sacred performance. The act of care was not hidden in a back room. It was staged in front of the god, a visible proof that the temple honoured him with constant attention. The wonder was not a finished product left to gather dust. It was a continuous process, a fragile technical theatre that required a dedicated staff to sustain the illusion of a living god. A modern visitor might assume that a wonder is a completed monument, a static object to admire. But the statue of Zeus was closer to a machine. It needed fuel, it needed operators, it needed a climate controlled by human effort. The ore did not come from stone. It came from wood, ivory, gold, oil, and the daily labour of a few priests who knew that if they stopped, the god would begin to fade. This reframes the entire idea of ancient wonder. The statue was not built once and then left to endure. It was serviced, polished, protected, and renewed. Its survival depended on a culture of care. The moment that culture broke, the god would not simply be forgotten. He would physically deteriorate. The ivory would curl. The gold would tarnish. The oil would evaporate. The wonder was as fragile as the hands that maintained it. And that raises a deeper question. What happens when political power, not devotion, tries to own that kind of awe? When an emperor looks at a statue that seems too powerful to be merely an object, the story does not end with oil and cloth. It becomes a story of control, theft, and legend. When a statue seems too alive, people begin to imagine it can answer back. The god was maintained like a sacred machine, but he also lived in the minds of those who saw him. And that second life produced stories that refused to stay quiet. One of the strangest legends comes from the Roman historian Suetonius. The Emperor Caligula, known for his appetite for absolute power, decided that the statue of Zeus at Olympia should no longer bear the face of the king of the gods. He ordered his workmen to remove the head and replace it with a portrait of himself. The story says that as the crew approached the towering figure, the statue let out a sudden loud laugh. The workmen dropped their tools and fled in terror. The project was abandoned. The tale is almost certainly not a literal record of events, but it tells a deeper truth. The statue was so overwhelming, so saturated with presence, that people believed it could react. It was not only a sculpture, it was a player in political and psychological dramas. Emperors wanted to own it, and common people whispered that it could not be owned. Other whispers added to the mystery. Some visitors claimed that the god moved, that hidden levers or mechanisms allowed the priest to make the statue gesture or shift slightly, as if it were acknowledging the prayers below. No such machinery has ever been found, but the rumour itself is revealing. A statue that could be mistaken for a living body was a statue that had crossed a boundary. The boundary between art and power was barely visible at Olympia. The temple itself was funded by fines levied against athletes and cities that broke the sacred truce of the games. Those silver coins, paid in shame, helped to keep the god gleaming. So the statue sat at the centre of a system that turned human failure into divine magnificence. It was not only a religious object, it was a monument to order, to the idea that even the most powerful Greeks were subject to a higher rule. And yet, for all its symbolic weight, the statue had a very practical problem. It was heavy. The seated figure rose to a height of roughly 12 metres, and the wooden core that held the ivory and gold had to bear an immense load. Over time, the sheer mass of the materials pressed down on the wooden skeleton. The priests and craftsmen who maintained the oil pool and polished the ivory were also fighting a slow, invisible battle against gravity. A god who seemed to defy time was, in the workshop sense, a structure under constant strain. These stories, the laughing statue, the hidden levers, the weight of the wood, are not just colourful footnotes, they are evidence of impact. The wonder was so potent that it blurred the distinction between a crafted object and a living presence. It became a magnet for legend, a mirror for imperial ambition, and a silent judge of athletic honour. Its real power lay not only in the gold and ivory, but in the human reactions it provoked. So the question that follows is not only about materials, it is about endings. How did a god so charged with meaning, so encased in stories and care, finally leave the world? The answer is tangled with the fall of the Olympic Games themselves, and with an emperor who decided that the old gods had no place in a new empire. In the year 393, the Emperor Theodosius issued a decree that closed the Olympic Games after more than 1,000 years of sacred competition. The temples of Olympia lost their official purpose, the altars fell silent. And the statue of Zeus, the great chryselephantine god that had commanded awe for 8 centuries, suddenly became an object without a function, a wonder without a congregation. But it did not vanish overnight. The ivory and gold were not smashed in place. Instead, the statue was carefully taken apart and carried east, away from the quiet sanctuary, toward the new heart of the empire. Constantinople received it, not as debris, but as a prize. It was placed inside the Palace of Lausus, a grand collection of pagan treasures assembled by a wealthy eunuch of the court. There, the Zeus stood among other captured gods, the Aphrodite of Cnidos, the Hera of Samos, a museum of the old world stored before it could be forgotten. For a few decades the god survived in this gilded exile. The ivory skin still gleamed under oil lamps. The gold robe still caught the light. But the priests who had once tended it were gone. The olive oil pool that had guarded it from decay was absent. The workshop knowledge of Phidias, the rhythm of daily care, the culture that understood how to keep a god alive, none of that could be moved across the sea. The statue was now only an object, beautiful and brittle, waiting in a palace built on borrowed time. In the year 475, a great fire swept through Constantinople. The flames reached the Palace of Lausus and consumed it. Ivory does not survive fire. Gold softens, pools, and disappears into the ash. The wooden skeleton that had held the giant together for centuries turned to smoke. The morning light that once made the god seem alive never touched it again. The statue of Zeus was gone. This was not a single catastrophic night. It was a slow unravelling. First the games ended, then the temple lost its meaning, then the god was uprooted and transplanted into a world that no longer knew how to worship it. And finally, the fire did what neglect could not. The disappearance of the statue is a story about more than destruction. It is a story about the collapse of a maintenance culture. Wonders are not only built, they are kept alive by people, by memory, by thin layers of oil and careful hands. When those systems vanish, even a god made of gold and ivory can dissolve into history. What remains of Zeus today is a name, a few workshop tools at Olympia, and the descriptions of travellers who saw him when the world still believed he could listen. But the lesson lingers. A wonder's fragility is not just in its materials. It is in the human world that surrounds it, and when that world changes, the wonder does not always change with it. From a god that burned inside a palace, we turn now to a temple that was also a bank, a sanctuary, and a swamp-bound marvel. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus did not simply house a goddess. It held fortunes. It offered refuge to criminals and kings. It stood on ground that should not have supported marble. And its story begins with a question that echoes the one we have just left behind. How do you build a wonder on a marsh? And what happens when the system that holds it up finally gives way? While the statue of Zeus was still holding its oil-slicked stillness in Olympia, another wonder had already turned into something even stranger. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was not simply a place of worship. It was one of the ancient world's most trusted banks. This was a temple that held gold. Not as decoration, not as a god's robe, but as a deposit. Kings, merchants, and whole cities brought their wealth here, convinced that the goddess herself would guard it better than any city wall. The temple's treasury was sacred. To steal from it was not merely theft. It was an attack on the divine order. And in a world where trust was thin, that made the temple a financial institution. The people who kept the keys were called the Melissi, the bee priestesses. Their name came from the insect that produces honey, a creature associated with the goddess Artemis in her most ancient wild form. These women did not merely tend a flame, they managed the deposits, oversaw the sanctuary, and represented the goddess's authority in matters of money. The temple was a vault, and the bees were its keepers. But wealth was only one kind of power. The temple also offered something rarer: safety. The right of asylum at Ephesus was absolute. Anyone who reached the sacred ground, a debtor, a runaway, a political fugitive, could not be touched. The temple's boundary was stronger than a king's edict. This turned the sanctuary into a strange kind of neutral zone, a place where the desperate and the powerful collided. It was a bank, a refuge, and a political stage all at once. So the wonder's fame was never only about its marble columns. Its beauty was backed by immense wealth and social force. The temple was not a quiet ruin in the making. It was a living system of finance, law, and ritual, humming with the tension of guarded gold and desperate sanctuary seekers. And yet, the builders of this marvel had chosen one of the worst possible places to anchor such a heavy, complicated institution. The ground at Ephesus was not solid rock. It was a marsh. How do you build a marble forest on a swamp? The temple was a bank, a sanctuary, and a political centre. But first it had to be built on ground that was more water than earth. The chosen site was a marshy plain near the mouth of the Cayster River, a place where the soil never fully dried. Earthquakes shook the region often, and floods spread across the flat land without warning. The question was not simply how to raise a temple of marble and gold. The question was how to make it stand at all when the ground beneath it wanted to swallow every stone. The man who answered that question was an architect named Chersiphron. He did not fight the marsh with deep foundations cut into bedrock, because there was no bedrock near the surface. Instead, he gave the temple a floor that could float. Beneath the massive platform of the temple, Chersiphron laid down a thick bed of charcoal and tightly packed sheepskins. The charcoal resisted moisture and kept the soil from rotting the stone. The sheepskins, pressed flat in many layers, acted like a cushion. When the earth trembled, the platform could shift slightly without cracking. When the river rose, the base did not drink up the water and soften into mud. It was a foundation that thought like a raft, not a root. A temple that was never fully anchored, and for that very reason never fully broken. With the ground stabilized, the next challenge arrived: how to move columns the size of towers across a wet, open landscape. Each column was not a single piece, but a stack of colossal marble drums, each one weighing many tons. The quarries lay miles away. Chersiphron's answer was so simple it feels almost playful. He turned the drums into wheels. A wooden frame was built around the stone cylinder, and the whole assembly was rolled along the road like an enormous spool. Oxen pulled, workers guided. The drum rotated forward, and what would have been a dead weight became a turning machine that carried itself. This was not a myth. It was a solution born from seeing the shape of the problem and letting the stone use its own form to travel. Over the marshy plain, across the shallow river crossings, the drums rolled toward the sacred precinct. When they arrived, they were lifted into place, one on top of another, until the temple stood surrounded by a forest of stone, 127 columns in total. Each one was a gift from a different king, and each one was a signature of a ruler who wanted his name written into the wonder's body. The columns did not merely hold the roof, they held the ambitions of an entire region. The final piece of the building legend is the Great Architrave, the horizontal beam that rested on top of the columns. Ancient stories say that the block was so large and so heavy that no human effort could lift it into place. Chersiphron, exhausted by the problem, fell into a troubled sleep. In his dream, the goddess Artemis herself appeared and promised that she had already set the stone in position. When he woke, the beam was resting perfectly in its place, as though it had moved by divine will. It is a beautiful story, and whether or not a god lifted the last stone, the deeper truth is that the temple came close enough to the impossible that people needed a story to explain how it had been done at all. This was not a building that relied only on wealth and piety. It was a product of clever, adaptive engineering, a structure that turned a swamp into a support system, a stone drum into a wheel, and a problem of weight into a story of divine assistance. The temple rose from mud through human ingenuity and risk, a wonder that literally floated on a man-made cushion. And yet, the very fame that made the temple a wonder also drew danger toward it. A building that had survived floods and tremors, that had been carried by kings' gifts and rolled across the plain, would one day face an enemy it could not engineer away. An enemy made of fire and a single human name that refused to be forgotten. The temple stood, a floating forest of marble. But fame, once earned, can be a dangerous thing. And so the question turns, why did such a cleverly built temple become a target for destruction? The answer lies in a night of fire and a man who wanted to be remembered. On the night of July the 21st, in the year 356 before Christ, a man walked into the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus carrying fire. His name was Herostratus. He was not a king, not a general, not a priest. He was an ordinary man who had decided that the surest way to become immortal was to destroy the most beautiful building in the world. The flames caught the wooden roof beams, then the cedar doors, then the offerings hung on the walls. By morning, the great temple was a smoking shell. The columns still stood, but the heart of the sanctuary had burned away. The city's response was swift and severe. The authorities executed Herostratus, but execution was not enough. They passed a decree that his name should never be spoken or written again, that no record should carry it into the future. The ancient world had a term for this, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The idea was simple. If a name is never repeated, the person who owned it ceases to exist in human time. But that decree created a paradox. To enforce the forgetting, officials had to record the crime and the punishment. Historians wrote it down, sometimes with moral outrage, sometimes with a shudder of recognition. The name that was supposed to vanish became a story that travelled. Centuries later, writers still knew the name Herostratus, precisely because others had tried so hard to erase it. And there was another detail that made the story impossible to forget. The fire happened on the same night that Alexander the Great was born, far away in Macedonia. Ancient sources saw a sign in this coincidence. One life that would build an empire entered the world on the same night that a monument of the old world turned to ash. Years later, when Alexander passed through Ephesus, he offered to pay for the complete restoration of the temple. His only condition was that his own name be inscribed on the new building. The Ephesians, with a diplomacy that still echoes, politely refused. They told him it was not fitting for one god to build a temple to another goddess. The temple was rebuilt, grander than before. But the fire had changed something. It had proven that fame is a double-edged blade. The same reputation that drew pilgrims and kings also drew the man who wanted to steal a piece of that light for himself. The fire was not the end of the wonder. It was a wound that became part of the wonder's story. The temple's name grew heavier, not lighter, after the smoke cleared. It now carried not only beauty and wealth and sacred lore, but also the dark magnetism of destruction. The fire could not erase the temple's memory, but the stones themselves began a long journey into other walls, other cities, and finally into a swamp. So what happened to those stones? The fire made the temple's name immortal, but its stones were scattered like seeds. Some of them travelled across the sea to Constantinople, where the great church of Hagia Sophia was rising. The builders needed columns, and the ruined temple at Ephesus still held green marble pillars that had once stood around the goddess. Those columns were lifted, shipped, and set inside a Christian basilica. where they still carry the weight of a dome that belongs to another world. The wonder did not simply fall. It was digested by an empire, its bones reused in a new body of faith. But not everything could be carried away. The ground itself began to take back what remained. The marsh that ancient engineers had once tamed with charcoal and sheepskins slowly returned. The Caister River kept pushing silt toward the sea. The harbour that had made Ephesus rich disappeared inland, and the temple sites sank under layers of mud and forgetfulness. For centuries, the place where one of the seven wonders once stood became a swampy field, its exact location lost to memory. Then, in the 1860s, a Victorian architect named John Turtle Wood arrived with a dream and a copy of an ancient text. He believed that the temple could be found again, not by digging blindly, but by following the instructions left by the very engineers who had built it. The ancient writer Pliny had described how the temple was placed on marshy ground to protect it from earthquakes. Wood reasoned that the ruins must lie near the old shoreline, buried under the accumulated silt. He spent 6 years searching, digging trenches, and listening to local stories. The work was slow, exhausting, and often hopeless. But in December of 1869 his team struck marble. What they uncovered was not the temple as it had been. The forest of 127 columns was gone. The gold, the paintings, the treasury chambers, all vanished. But one column still stood. It rose from the mud, broken at the top but still vertical, still holding its place after more than 2,000 years, and on top of it, a stork had built its nest. That image, one column in a marsh, with birds nesting above, became the visual epitaph of the Temple of Artemis. It was not a reconstruction. It was not a museum display. It was a living ruin where nature and history had made an uneasy peace. The column did not explain the wonder. It simply marked the spot where a world of ritual, money, asylum, and marble had once existed, and then it asked nothing more of the viewer. A forest of columns ended as one vertical memory in a swamp. The emptiness is more powerful than any reconstruction could ever be. The wonder did not need to be rebuilt to be felt. Its absence had become its own kind of presence. This is where the pattern deepens. A temple that held gods, criminals, merchants, and kings disappeared into a single stone with a bird's nest on top. But the list of 7 wonders does not end with absence. It moves toward a different kind of survival. What happens when a wonder is built not just to honour a god or a city, but to fight death itself? That leads us to the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, a tomb that tried to make one man's name outlive his body, and in doing so gave the world a word that still builds monuments for the dead. From a temple that became a single column, we move to a tomb built by a woman who refused to let her husband disappear. In the 4th century before Christ, a ruler named Mausolus governed Caria, a wealthy strip of land on the southwestern coast of Anatolia, under the distant authority of the Persian king. He was a satrap, but he acted more like an independent king. And by his side was his sister wife, Artemisia. In Carian custom, close royal marriages kept power and property locked inside the dynasty. That was the political logic. But when Mausolus died, the politics seemed to vanish behind something far more personal and far harder to control: grief. The ancient sources describe a woman who refused to let her husband's presence fade. One story, repeated by writers for centuries, claims that Artemisia mixed a portion of Mausolus's ashes into her daily wine. She drank him, the story says, so that she might become his living tomb. There is no way to confirm whether that actually happened. The tale may be a later invention, or it may be an exaggeration of a real mourning ritual. But the fact that the story persisted tells you what the ancient world already sensed about this wonder. Its engine was not politics, and not religion. It was a love so fierce it demanded to be made visible in stone. Artemisia did more than mourn. She took the enormous revenues of Caria and poured them into a single purpose. She levied heavy taxes, and according to some accounts, she even taxed the city's hair, a tax paid not in money but in shorn locks, a public display of sacrifice. She ordered the capital moved from the old inland city of Mylassa to the coastal city of Halicarnassus, transforming it into a stage fit for her husband's memory. The new capital would have a deep harbour, fortified walls, a palace, and at its heart, rising above everything else, a tomb so grand that no one would ever forget the name Mausolus. The Mausoleum, as it came to be called, was not a simple burial chamber. It was a building designed to defeat disappearance itself. It was a monument to grief, ambition, and the desperate hope that love can outlast a body. This is what makes it different from the other wonders. The Great Pyramid was built by a pharaoh to ensure his journey into the afterlife. The Temple of Artemis was a house for a goddess, a bank, a sanctuary. The Statue of Zeus was a crafted god. But the Mausoleum began with something smaller, more fragile and more universal, one human being unable to let go of another. The wonder's origin is intimate grief, not the impersonal machinery of state power. A woman, in the aftermath of a loss that felt impossible to bear, decided to build a building that could carry her husband's name into every language that followed. That decision changed the architectural vocabulary of the world. The tomb was so famous that its very name, Mausoleum, became the word for any grand tomb, from Rome to London to the Taj Mahal. Grief gave the mausoleum its purpose, but it would take 4 masters of sculpture to give it a form that would outlast stone. Grief gave the mausoleum its purpose, but art gave it its form. And the hands that shaped that form belonged to 4 of the most celebrated sculptors of the age. Their names still survive in the record: Scopas, Bryaxis, Timotheus, and Leochares. Each was assigned one side of the tomb, and each brought a different style, a different understanding of muscle, motion, and story carved into marble. Scopas took the east. He was known for faces that showed inner feeling, for bodies twisted by emotion. Bryaxis worked the north, a master of dense, dramatic crowds and powerful animal forms. Timotheus carved the south, bringing a more delicate, almost graceful line to his figures. Leochares, who had already worked for the family, claimed the west, and his style carried something of the divine, a sense of figures frozen just before flight. The project was not simply a division of labour, it was a kind of silent competition. 4 masters, all alive at the same time, all working on the same building, each knowing that travellers would walk around the tomb and compare one side with the next. A visitor from Athens could see a hand he recognised. A merchant from the islands might notice that the north told its myth in a different rhythm from the east. And the family that commissioned the tomb knew exactly what they were doing. They gathered the best available artists, gave each a stage, and let the quality of the work become part of the monument's fame. At the very top of everything, above the columns and the carved reliefs, stood the crowning group, a marble quadriga, a 4-horse chariot carrying Mausolus and Artemisia. The chariot was not only decoration, it was a statement. Here was a man who had been a satrap, a ruler who had moved his capital, who had built a fleet, and now he was lifted into the sky in the company of horses that looked like they were still moving. The statue group was over 4 meters high, and from the ground below it would have read as a silhouette against the sky, a last gesture of speed and ascent. Below the quadriga, the roof rose as a stepped pyramid of 24 levels, reaching a total of around 45 meters. A statue of a lion or perhaps a warrior may have stood at the very peak catching the last light of the day. The roof sat on a colonnade of 36 slender columns, 10 on each long side and 9 on the short ends. Between the columns, statues stood in the spaces, so that the tomb looked less like a solid block and more like a gallery of figures standing in the open air, visible from every angle. And at the base, on a high podium, the sculptural program became even denser. 3 friezes wrapped the building. One showed a battle between Greeks and Amazons, another carried a chariot race, a scene of speed and danger. A third depicted a centauromachy, the fight between civilized men and wild half-horses, a myth that always meant something about order against chaos. And guarding the approach, stone lions faced outward, their bodies low and heavy, as if the tomb itself had its own permanent guardians. None of this was the vision of a single artist. The mausoleum was a distributed work of art, a collective effort to make one man's memory into a world-class spectacle. It was not a temple, not a palace, not a statue. It was a gallery of the best sculpture of its time, assembled in one place to fight against the one thing that cannot be fought, the disappearance of a name from the world. But stone can be repurposed, and the question that rises next is not about erosion or time. It is about what happened when later builders looked at this mountain of marble and saw raw material. Why did one of the most beautiful buildings of the ancient world end up inside the walls of a fortress? The mausoleum's sculptors had carved a monument to outlast death, but its stone would soon meet a different kind of afterlife. In the early 15th century, the Knights Hospitaller arrived at the coast of Halicarnassus. They needed a fortress to guard the harbour against Ottoman ships. The raw material lay everywhere around them, a ruined ancient tomb still rising above the shore, its marble shining in the Mediterranean light. To the knights, these carved stones were not a wonder. They were a quarry. In that age, ancient ruins were often seen as ready building stock. Marble could be burned in lime kilns and turned into mortar. A sculpted lion could become a block in a wall. A frieze showing a battle could be faced inward, hidden from sight, and used as simple masonry. The mausoleum did not fall in a single catastrophe. It was slowly absorbed into the growing fortress that would become Bodrum Castle. The dismantling was systematic. The giant quadriga, the four-horse chariot that once crowned the tomb, was pulled down and broken. The sculpted reliefs that Scopas, Braxis, Timotheus and Leochares had carved with such care were pried from the walls. Some were smashed and fed into the lime kilns, others were laid into the castle's foundations, their carved faces turned against the mortar. The massive stone blocks of the stepped pyramid roof became part of the fortress ramparts. A wonder that had taken years to build was being consumed in months, not by an earthquake or a fire, but by human hands that saw only the value of ready-cut stone. Yet this recycling, as violent as it was, created a strange kind of preservation. Some of the most delicate carvings survived precisely because they were sealed inside the castle's walls. They were protected from the rain, the wind, and the later stone robbers who might have ground them to dust. For 4 centuries the hidden friezes and the marble lions sat in darkness, waiting for a different kind of eye to recognise them. That eye belonged to Charles Newton, a British archaeologist working in the 19th century. When he came to Bodrum, he did not see a fortress. He saw a tomb that had been swallowed by a castle. Newton noticed that some of the walls contained marble blocks that did not match the medieval stone around them. He traced the outlines of ancient carvings buried in the masonry. With permission from the Ottoman authorities, he began to extract the fragments. What emerged were sections of the great Amazonomachy frieze, the statues of lions that had guarded the tomb, and the colossal figures of Mausolus and Artemisia that now reside in the British Museum. The mausoleum had lost its body, but its art was given a second life in gallery halls, where millions of eyes could study what the knights had tried to forget. So the mausoleum became a physical palimpsest. Its stone is scattered across a Turkish peninsula, some in a castle, some in a museum, much of it burned into lime long ago. But its name survived in a way that few other ancient words have. Every mausoleum built since that time, every grand tomb designed to fight against forgetting, carries the echo of that one man's name. The building fell, but the word stayed. And the hidden carvings that Newton pulled from the fortress walls remind us that, even when a wonder is dismantled, it can leave fragments that refuse to disappear. The next wonder was not dismantled by human hands, but by an earthquake. Its story begins with a giant made from the metal of war. From the mausoleum's stone being recycled into a fortress, we turn to a wonder that was itself recycled from the tools of war. Almost everyone who pictures the Colossus of Rhodes sees the same thing. A towering bronze figure, legs planted on opposite sides of the harbour entrance, ships sailing between its ankles. This image has travelled through centuries of paintings, textbooks and film. It is instantly recognisable. It is also almost certainly wrong. Ancient descriptions by writers like Pliny the Elder and the geographer Strabo never mention a straddling pose. They describe a giant statue, but not a gateway. The harbour at Rhodes was far too wide to be spanned by any statue of the Colossus's size. The entrance was somewhere around 150 metres across. The Colossus itself was about 30 metres tall. Even if the figure were stretched into an impossible split, the legs could not have reached both sides without collapsing under impossible forces. The famous image is a medieval fantasy, painted onto the ancient world long after the real statue had fallen. So what did the Rhodians actually build? The real Colossus stood on a single shore, most likely near the harbour but not straddling it. It was not a gate, it was a guardian. And the story of how it came to be is, in many ways, more powerful than the myth it replaced. In the year 305 BC, the city of Rhodes faced a siege by Demetrius Poliorcetes, one of the most inventive and relentless military commanders of the age. Demetrius brought enormous siege towers, catapults, and armoured battering rams. He even constructed a moving tower called the Helepolis, a 9-story war machine clad in iron plates. For an entire year, he hammered the city. But Rhodes did not fall. When Demetrius finally withdrew, he left behind a fortune in abandoned war machinery, bronze, iron, timber, and the wreckage of his failed ambition. The Rhodians gathered up the metal from those engines and sold part of it. With the rest, they decided to raise a monument. They would take the very weapons meant to destroy their city and melt them down into a colossal statue of the sun god Helios, their divine protector. The Colossus was born from the bronze of enemy catapults and siege towers. It was a war trophy cast not out of plunder, but out of survival. This correction does not reduce the wonder. If anything, it makes the Colossus more moving. A statue that once straddled a harbour is a fantasy, a theatrical invention. A statue that rose from the wreckage of a year-long siege, a declaration that the city would not be broken, is a reality that still sends a shiver through the imagination. The Colossus was not an archway for ships. It was a body shaped from victory. Every inch of its bronze skin had once been aimed at the city's destruction. Now that same metal stood tall, polished bright, facing the sea. The straddling myth shows how later ages love to amplify. But the truth is a stronger story. A bronze giant 30 meters high, standing on the shore, perhaps with a hand raised to shield its eyes as it looked out over the water. Every ship approaching Rhodes saw that figure, not as a passage to sail under, but as a guardian watching over the city. It was a monument to a people who refused to be conquered, made from the very tools meant to erase them. The Colossus was not a gateway for ships. It was a monument to survival, built from the captured metal of war. The wonder's true message is not about spanning a harbour. It is about transforming defeat into a beacon of resilience. But building a hollow bronze body 30 meters tall came with a terrifying engineering challenge. How do you keep such a massive statue from folding under its own weight? The answer lies in the hidden structure inside, and in the risk that almost brought the whole project down before it was finished. The Colossus was not a harbour gate, but a war-born guardian. And that raises a different question. How do you build a bronze body 30 meters high, hollow, yet strong enough to stand against the wind and its own crushing weight? Imagine a statue twice your height. Now double the height again. Every time you double the size, the volume does not simply double, it multiplies by 8. The weight grows faster than the strength of the material that holds it up. This is the quiet rule of geometry that every builder of giants must face. A small bronze figure can balance on 2 thin ankles. A towering one cannot. Its own mass becomes the enemy. Pharos of Lindos, the sculptor from Rhodes, understood this danger. He had learned bronze work from Lysippos, the master who made Alexander the Great look both human and immortal. But no teacher had built a figure this size. The metal alone would buckle under its own load unless the inside was filled with something that shared the burden. So Charis designed the Colossus from the inside out. An iron skeleton rose first, anchored deep into a stone base. Around it, workers packed stone blocks and clay, layer by layer, as the body climbed. This inner core was not mere filler. It was the spine that kept the bronze skin from folding. Meanwhile, an earthen ramp grew alongside the statue, a sloping mountain of soil that served as scaffolding. Bronze plates, cast in sections and hammered thin, were lifted up that ramp and fixed to the iron frame. Each plate was shaped to fit the one below it, like the scales of a giant. The statue rose inside a man-made hill, invisible until the earth was pulled away. The method was brilliant, but it was also terrifying. The ramp had to be stable, the iron had to be forged without hidden cracks, the stone filling had to settle evenly, or the whole shell would twist, and the workers could not see the outside of the statue until the very end. Any mistake in the casting or the joinery would be buried under tons of metal and soil. Charles could only trust his calculations and hope the ground did not betray him. The project took 12 years. 12 years of heat, dust, molten bronze, and the constant risk that a storm or a tremor could undo years of labour. Ancient sources, including the writer Pliny, note that the cost was immense, and one later tradition adds a darker note. It says that Chares, after discovering a flaw in the design or facing ruin from cost overruns, took his own life. No one can confirm that story. It may be only a shadow thrown by the sheer scale of the strain. But the legend survives because it makes sense. The Colossus was not a calm commission. It was a gamble with gravity, and the man who staked everything on it may have been crushed by the same weight he sought to conquer. Even if the suicide story is not true, the human cost was real. Every ton of bronze came from melted weapons left behind by Demetrius, the failed invader. The labour was skilled and dangerous. The bronze plates had to be heated and shaped with precision. One slip in the forge could mean death. One misaligned plate could cascade into collapse. The Colossus was an experiment in material limits, a declaration that a city could turn the metal of war into a body that touched the sky. It stood as a triumph of ancient metallurgy and nerve, but that very ambition made it fragile. A solid stone pyramid can survive earthquakes, a hollow bronze giant cannot. The seed of its fall was planted in its design. The statue stood for just over half a century. Then, in the year 226 before Christ, the ground shook. The giant's knees, the narrow point where all that mass concentrated, snapped. The Colossus fell. What happened next was almost as strange as the building of it. The earthquake struck in the year 226 before Christ. No one could have planned for it, but the Colossus had a hidden weakness. Its bronze skin, iron skeleton, and stone core were designed to resist gravity and wind, not the violent lateral shaking of an earthquake. The statue snapped at the knees, the weakest point where the massive upper body met the legs. It did not tip gracefully. It broke and crashed onto the rocky shore, a man-made mountain of metal falling from the sky. The sound must have been terrifying. A groaning of iron, a tearing of bronze plates, then a deep earth-punching thud that echoed across the harbour. When the dust cleared, the god of the sun was lying on the ground. Even fallen, he was still enormous. A grown person could walk around a single finger. The hollow interior of the broken limbs revealed the stone filling and iron bars that had held him up. What was once a towering beacon became a sprawling landscape of wreckage. The Rhodians were devastated. They had built this giant as a victory monument, a thank you to the sun god Helios for saving their city from a siege. To see it shattered felt like losing divine protection. They consulted an oracle, hoping for permission to rebuild. The oracle, according to later accounts, forbade it. Some say the priests feared the god was angry. Others suspect political pressure from rivals who did not want Rhodes to regain its symbol of power. Whatever the reason, the command was clear: do not raise the fallen. And so, for over 800 years, the bronze body lay where it had crashed. But here is the strange thing. The Colossus did not vanish from memory. It became a different kind of wonder. Travellers sailed to Rhodes not to see a standing statue, but to walk among its ruins. They would stand beside a broken arm as thick as a tree trunk, or try to wrap their own arms around a thumb. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who saw the fragments about 2 centuries after the fall, wrote that few people could join their hands around the thumb. He marvelled that the hollow insides looked like caves, with huge stones visible inside the metal skin. The wreckage was a ruin, but a ruin of such scale that it was still counted among the world's marvels. The fallen Colossus became a kind of pilgrimage site. It proved the ambition of the ancient world. It showed that humans could build something so large that even its broken pieces were astonishing. The statue lived longer as a ruin than it ever had as a standing monument. For 8 centuries the bronze body lay on the shore, a silent testament to the city's old power and the god's lost favour. Then, in the 7th century after Christ, Arab forces captured Rhodes. The new rulers looked at the bronze wreckage not as a sacred ruin, but as a mountain of valuable metal. They sold the remains to a Jewish merchant from Edessa. The story says it took 900 camels to carry the bronze away. 900 camels. The metal was melted down, probably turned into coins, tools, or weapons, and dispersed across the Mediterranean. The body of the Colossus vanished into the marketplace, too heavy to move in one piece, but light enough to disappear into 1,000 small transactions. The giant that had once dominated the harbour became a ghost of commerce. No trace of the original bronze survives today. Yet the idea of the Colossus refused to die. In the 19th century, when France gave the United States a colossal statue to celebrate liberty and friendship, the designers looked back to Rhodes. The Statue of Liberty, standing in New York Harbour, carries a torch and wears a crown of solar spikes. Her pose echoes the ancient Helios. She's not a copy, but she's a descendant. The fallen bronze giant got a second body in a different land, made of copper and iron, with a new name. The memory of the Colossus found a new home. So the wonder that stood for less than 60 years ended up inspiring a symbol of freedom for millions. It survived not as metal, but as a shape in the imagination. And that is the pattern we keep finding. A wonder can fall, burn, dissolve, or be sold for scrap, but its name can travel across oceans and centuries, waiting to be rebuilt in another form. From a fallen bronze body on a Greek shore, we move now to a wonder that fell into the sea, but whose name rose into language itself, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. From a fallen bronze giant that became a legend, we turn to a tower that was built to be seen and to save lives. The harbour of Alexandria was one of the busiest in the ancient world, but its entrance was a trap. Low reefs and hidden sandbars had claimed hundreds of ships over the years. On a moonless night, a captain could hear the surf on the rocks before he saw them, and by then it was too late. A city that wanted to be the centre of Mediterranean trade could not afford to lose ships to its own coastline. The answer was not another temple or statue. It was a machine of light, built on the island of Pharos just off the coast. For as long as men had sailed, they had navigated by landmarks, a mountain peak, a cliff, a bonfire on the shore. But here the coastline was flat and featureless. A tower tall enough and bright enough could serve as an artificial star, a fixed point visible long before the rocks became dangerous. The project began around 290 years before Christ, under Ptolemy I, the general who had inherited Egypt after Alexander's death. The work was finished by his son, Ptolemy II. The architect was a man named Sostratus of Cnidus. He did not simply design a tall platform with a fire, he designed a mountain in 3 carefully shaped tiers. The base was a square, about 30 metres high, broad and massively built. This was the anchor, designed to absorb the weight of the entire structure and to stand against the constant pounding of the sea. Above it rose an octagonal section, 8 faces, a shape that cut the wind rather than fighting it. This was the secret to the tower's survival in storms that had toppled older buildings. At the very top, a circular section housed the lantern, the crown of the tower where the flame would burn. The whole structure reached more than 100 metres into the Mediterranean sky. It was taller than every other building in the ancient world except the 2 Great Pyramids at Giza. But unlike those pyramids, this tower had a job. It was not a tomb. It was not a monument to a dead king. It was the world's first purpose-built lighthouse, a skyscraper built around a single practical mission: send a signal that would keep ships alive. By day, the pale limestone caught the sun, a white finger pointing to heaven, but its true power came at night. To reach the island, the builders constructed a causeway nearly 1.5 kilometres long, the Heptastadion, a stone bridge that connected Pharos to the mainland. This massive mole not only carried workers, fuel and supplies to the tower, but it also created 2 separate harbours, one on each side. The island became part of the city's front door, and the lighthouse became the most visible thing for miles. And perhaps the most lasting miracle of the Pharos is not the stone, but the word. In Greek, the island was called Pharos. The lighthouse took the island's name. Then the name began to travel. In Latin, it became Pharos. In French, Phare. In Italian and Spanish, Pharaoh. In English, the word Pharos itself is still used to mean lighthouse. The tower would eventually crumble into the sea, but its name outlived the stone and spread across the world. So the Lighthouse of Alexandria was not just a wonder to admire. It was a working machine that saved lives every night it burned. It was the youngest of the 7 wonders, and the most immediately useful, a fusion of science and spectacle that announced Alexandria's power more clearly than any palace or temple. But the tower's height was only half the story. The real mystery was the light itself. How could a flame be seen from more than 50 kilometres away? And what kind of mirror could throw that light across the sea? The lighthouse stood as a mountain of light, but its most famous feature was the mirror that turned a flame into a weapon and a signal. Ancient writers whispered that the great mirror of Pharos could set enemy ships on fire while they were still far out at sea. The beam, they said, was visible for 50 kilometres or more, a searching eye that no hostile fleet could escape. Arab geographers repeated the story centuries later, adding details about polished metal surfaces and a mechanism that could swivel the reflector to track vessels on the horizon. A lighthouse that could burn invaders before they reached the shore felt like something out of legend, and that is exactly where it lived for a long time. The physics does not fully support the burning ship claim. A large concave mirror can focus sunlight into a hot point, but the distance would have to be short and the target steady. On a moving ship across salt haze and waves, the heat would scatter before it could ignite wood. However, reflecting the flame itself is a different matter. A polished bronze plate behind the fire could catch the light and throw it forward in a concentrated beam, much like a modern searchlight. That may have been the real heart of the mirror story. Not a death ray, but a brilliant signal that seemed almost supernatural to anyone watching from the water. The mirror was probably a carefully shaped bronze disc, or a set of polished plates arranged to form a curved reflector. Bronze was used because it could take a mirror finish and resisted the salty air better than other metals. The surface would have needed constant polishing by the lighthouse keepers, who climbed the tower not only to feed the flame but to maintain the eye that gave it reach. Some accounts suggest the mirror was mounted in a way that allowed it to tilt, catching the low morning sun or the fiery glow of the wood and oil burning at the summit. By day, it could flash sunlight. By night, it amplified the beacon into a column of light that stabbed across the dark sea. There is also a quieter possibility. The height of the tower already made it a natural observatory. With or without a burning mirror, the keepers could see farther than anyone else. They could spot storms, watch for approaching ships, and signal the city. The mirror may have been as much a tool for watching as for shining, a polished surface that gathered light and also gathered information. In that sense, the lighthouse was not just a finger of fire pointing upward. It was an eye that never closed. The legend of the burning mirror did something powerful. It turned a technical achievement into a rumour of almost magical force. Even if the story was exaggerated, it made the lighthouse more than stone and flame. It made it a presence. Sailors who had never seen Alexandria spoke of the tower that could see them before they saw land. Merchants whispered that the mirror could count their ships. Enemies wondered if the city had a weapon hidden in plain sight. The mirror, real or not, extended Alexandria's reach beyond its walls, into the imagination of everyone who crossed the eastern Mediterranean. That is the strange double life of the Pharos mirror. It was both a practical device and a story that grew larger than the device itself. The rumour became part of the wonder, a light that could be seen and feared, a watchman made of polished bronze and human care. The tower did not simply stand at the edge of the sea. It looked outward, and the world looked back, uncertain where the flame ended and the myth began. While the light shone outward, the inner workings of the tower were a different story. How did the fuel reach the top? The mirror projected the light, but inside the tower, a different kind of work kept the flame alive. Step inside the lighthouse, and the soaring, luminous exterior gives way to something unexpected. A wide, spiralling passage that climbs through the dark heart of the tower. This was not a narrow staircase for priests or a decorative ramp for a few visitors. It was a working road, built of granite blocks and wide enough for 2 donkeys to pass each other without slowing down. The ramp wound upward in a slow corkscrew, rising over 100 metres from the base to the lantern room at the top. Think of a modern parking garage ramp, but ancient, lit only by occasional slit windows and the flicker of oil lamps set into the walls. The air inside was cool, heavy with stone dust and the distant smell of the sea. Every night, donkeys or mules plodded up this incline loaded with bundles of wood, jars of oil, or whatever fuel the great beacon required. They carried the fire's food. The climb was long and steady, the animals' hooves echoing off the curved walls, the sound of their breathing filling the shaft. At the summit, the fuel was fed into the brazier, and the light poured out across the water. Without this constant grinding supply chain, the mirror and the flame would have been empty symbols. The wonder depended on muscles moving in darkness, and the tower had a voice as well as a light. At the very top where the lantern burned, the architect had placed huge bronze statues of Tritons, the mythical sea messengers. But these were not mere decoration. They were pivoted to face the wind, their trumpets turning with the gusts, acting as wind vanes that showed sailors the direction of the air before they even left the harbour. When fog swallowed the light, the tower may have spoken in a different way. Ancient accounts suggest that horns or massive bronze bells boomed across the water, a sound that could guide a ship when sight failed. The lighthouse was a machine of sight and sound, a navigational system built into one vertical form. All of this, the fuel, the animals, the wind vanes, the fog signals, was the hidden engine of the wonder. The beam that sailors saw from miles away was the product of a relentless, unglamorous routine inside the stone, The gleaming white marble on the outside never hinted at the donkeys climbing in the dark, the smoke, the sweat, the patient labour that filled the tower's core. But the ramp was not only for animals. Ancient visitors climbed it too. The lighthouse was one of the world's first tourist attractions, and from its viewing platform you could look out over the sweep of the Mediterranean, the city of Alexandria, and the desert beyond. For centuries, it was the tallest structure on Earth, and people paid to stand at the top and feel the world fall away beneath them. The lighthouse was not a silent monument. It was a living system, a vertical factory of light powered by muscle, fire, and the patient climb of animals through the darkness. Every night the wonder depended on this hidden labour, a truth that the elegant exterior carefully concealed. But who designed this machine? The story of its architect is a tale of hidden identity, of a name that waited centuries to be read. Sostratus of Cnidus was the man who designed the Lighthouse of Alexandria. But for a long time, the official story tried to bury his name under a layer of royal plaster. The lighthouse was one of the most expensive and technically ambitious projects of the Hellenistic age. It was commissioned by Ptolemy I and completed under his son, Ptolemy II. A monument of that scale normally carried the name of the ruler who paid for it, carved into the stone for all to see. And indeed, when the tower was finished, there was an inscription on the base. It dedicated the structure to the gods, on behalf of King Ptolemy. The king's name was there, visible to every ship that entered the harbour. But the ancient writer Lucian tells a different story. He says that Sostratus carved something else into the stone first. He carved his own name. Then he covered it with a thin layer of plaster, and on that soft surface he wrote the dedication to Ptolemy. The plaster looked permanent. It was smooth and white, and it carried the royal name just as the king had wanted. But underneath, the true builder's name was already waiting. This was a quiet, patient act of defiance. Sostratus knew that plaster is not stone. Over decades and centuries, wind and salt spray would work on that surface. Rain would find its way into the tiny cracks. The plaster would weaken, flake, and fall away. And when it did, the hidden inscription would emerge, and the world would know who really built the tower. He had not refused the king's order, he had simply given time the final word. For a long time, the plaster held. The lighthouse stood, and the official dedication was what people saw. But the sea air is relentless. Slowly the royal layer began to crumble, and as it did, the older, deeper letters beneath it started to appear. By the time the Roman period was well underway, travellers who visited the Pharos reported seeing a different name on the stone. It was the name of Sostratus of Cnidus, son of Dexiphanes, dedicated to the saviour gods for the sake of those who sail the sea. The story may not be entirely literal. Some historians suspect Lucian embellished it, or that the inscription was always visible but arranged in a clever hierarchy. But the tale captures a deeper truth about monuments and memory. Every ruin eventually strips away the surface and exposes the original layer. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus lost its outer carvings to a fortress wall, but the hidden friezes survived inside. The Colossus of Rhodes fell, but its broken bronze body became more famous than any standing statue. Time erases the decoration and leaves the foundation. In the case of the lighthouse, the king's plaster is gone. The Ptolemaic dynasty is a chapter in history books. But Sostratus's name is still spoken, and the word Pharos itself travelled far beyond the island. It entered Greek, Latin, Arabic, French, Spanish, and English. It became the root word for lighthouse in many languages. The tower collapsed, but the name of the island and the name of the architect both refused to disappear. This hidden signature became a perfect small model of what the Seven Wonders really are. The surface is often a political act, a royal claim, a temporary layer, but underneath there is always the builder's hand, the craft, the long gamble. And when the plaster falls away, what remains is the name of the person who actually made the thing. In a way, Sostratus did not just build a lighthouse, he built a message that would only be fully received centuries after his death. The tower itself would not stand forever. A series of earthquakes starting around the 10th century and continuing for several hundred years gradually shook the pharaohs apart. The Great Mirror, the spiral ramp, the Triton statues, all of it came down. But the story does not end with the collapse. The sea that had once reflected the beacon's light now swallowed the fallen blocks, and there, under the water, the remnants of the pharaohs waited for a different kind of discovery. Off the coast of Alexandria, beneath the blue-green water, the seafloor holds a broken puzzle. Blocks of granite, some larger than a cart, lie scattered like fallen dominoes. Statues of ancient kings stare upward into the shifting light. This is what remains of the lighthouse, the Pharos, that once towered over the harbour, and it is more than just rubble. It is a memory preserved in salt and stone. Between the 10th and 14th centuries, a series of earthquakes struck the coast. The upper tiers of the lighthouse, weakened by time, collapsed into the sea. The lower levels stood for a while longer, but eventually their stone was taken. In the 15th century, a Mamluk sultan built a fortress directly on the foundations, using the fallen blocks as a quarry. The Qaitbay fort still stands there today, its walls filled with the bones of the ancient tower. But many of the heaviest pieces, the granite columns, the enormous lintels, had already slipped beneath the waves, and there they remained, unreachable for centuries. Then, in the 1990s, a French archaeologist named Jean-Yves Empereur began a systematic underwater survey of the harbour. What his team found astonished the world. More than 2,000 blocks lay on the seabed, some weighing over 50 tons. Colossal statues of Ptolemaic rulers emerged from the silt, their features smoothed but still commanding. Sphinxes, obelisks, even fragments of the lantern chamber itself. It was as if the sea had swallowed the tower and kept it safe, a museum that no drawing could match. Among the discoveries was a hidden secret of the tower's endurance. The Roman builders had used a material called pozzolana, a volcanic ash that, when mixed with lime, hardens underwater. The foundations of the lighthouse were chemically locked to the seabed. Ancient concrete that grew stronger in the sea, not weaker. It was a Roman innovation applied to a Greek wonder, a fusion of technologies that allowed the tower to defy the waves for over a millennium. But while the stones were sleeping under the water, the name Pharos had already escaped. Long before the last block fell, the word had travelled. It passed through Greek, into Latin, into Arabic, and from there into the languages of Europe and the Middle East. In French, a lighthouse is a fair. In Italian, Pharaoh. In Spanish, Pharaoh. In Romanian, phare. Even in Russian, a car headlight is a phara. The tower had become a word, and the word had become a light that still guides language today. The Lighthouse of Alexandria did not simply vanish. It fractured into 3 afterlives. Part of it became a fortress, standing guard over the same harbour. Part of it became an underwater archive, waiting for the right moment to be seen again. And part of it became a word that lives in a dozen tongues, spoken every day by millions who may never know its origin. Perhaps that is the truest triumph a wonder can have, to be so deeply woven into human culture that its name still shines every time we speak of a light by the sea. The 7 wonders have each left a different trace. Now, as we look back, what pattern do they form? The lighthouse became a word, and with that the journey through 100 facts of the 7 wonders comes full circle. A traveller once sat down and wrote a list of 7 things worth seeing. That list was never fixed. It was a selection, shaped by Greek eyes, copied by later hands, and edited by time. But now, after moving through stone, bronze, water and fire, the list looks different. The Great Pyramid still stands, the oldest survivor, but it did not survive intact. Its capstone is gone, its outer casing was stripped away, and hidden voids remain inside. It survived as endurance, not as a solved monument. The Hanging Gardens did not leave a single visible ruin. They survived as a memory that may have moved from Babylon to Nineveh, a mountain of green that dissolved back into clay and text. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was made of wood, ivory and gold, kept alive by oil and daily care. Then it was taken to Constantinople and burned in a palace fire. It survived as workshop traces and a description of a god who needed human hands. The Temple of Artemis was a temple bank, a sanctuary, and a wonder of marble built on a marsh. It was burned for fame, swallowed by a river, and now survives as one column with a stork's nest above it. The Mausoleum at Halicarnassus was a tomb built from grief and ambition, carved by 4 sculptors and crowned with a chariot. Knights tore it apart to build a fortress, and its statues were ground into lime. Yet it survived as a word, mausoleum, that now names every grand tomb. The Colossus of Rhodes stood for less than 60 years before an earthquake brought it down. The oracle said, "Do not rebuild." For centuries people came to see the fallen bronze giant, until it was sold for scrap and carried away on camels. It survived as an image of a broken body that imagination could not forget. The Lighthouse of Alexandria guided ships with fire and a polished mirror. Earthquakes dropped it into the sea, and a fortress rose from its blocks. Under the water, statues still lie among the stones, and its name, Pharos, spread into languages across the world. These are not just ruins. They are 7 different answers to the question of how something can be remembered after it is gone. The pyramid is stone endurance. The garden is a memory that moved. The god is a workshop and a fire. The temple is a single column. The tomb is a word for death. The giant is a fallen legend. The lighthouse is a word for light. And now the ancient list becomes a mirror. What would a modern list of wonders look like? What would survive of our own world if a future traveller wrote down 7 things that mattered? Would it be steel towers, glass cities, or something quieter? A digital archive, a seed vault in the ice, a radio signal still travelling outward? A wonder is not only what was built, it is what remains when the world can no longer keep it whole. The list is an archive of loss, but it is also proof that the need to remember is itself a kind of wonder. The ancient world did not leave us 7 monuments. It left us 7 doors, and most of them open into emptiness. But the emptiness is not silence. It is an invitation to imagine. And so we end with a quiet thought. What would our own world leave behind if a future traveller made a list after us? Maybe the first page of the ancient world was not the first page ever written by human hands. Maybe it was only the first page that survived.